The Intergenerational Dialogue Series was initiated with the intention of generating knowledge of past events surrounding the Civil War that spanned 3 decades to promote reconciliation, non-recurrence, and social responsibility through intergenerational discussion. Through this platform, we would like to share with you today some key findings of the recent research CEPA conducted on youth and identity discourse in post-war Sri Lanka. This research was conducted with the support of the Strengthening Reconciliation Processes in Sri Lanka SRP program, jointly funded by the European Union, GIZ, and the British Council. We will start with an introduction about the Sri Lanka Barometer, followed by a presentation of the research findings, and then we will conclude with a very interesting panel discussion with our esteemed panelists, and we will end with a Q&A session. Thank you for that introduction, which nicely leads us to share with you a brief overview of the study on youth and identity discourses in Sri Lanka. As you may have guessed, it fits in within the identity and belonging domain of the barometer, most directly, but also links to others in certain ways. So I would like to invite 2 of the researchers who were instrumental in conducting this study to present some of the key findings. Divya Rex, she's a research professional at CEPA. She holds a bachelor's degree in sociology at Southeastern University of Sri Lanka and has a master's degree in sociology from the University of Colombo. And Shanindra Amarasinghe is a junior research professional at CEPA. He holds a Bachelor of Science Honours degree in International Relations from the University of London and a Bachelor of Arts degree in English from the University of Colombo. I will invite them now to play the pre-recorded presentation. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Divya Rex. Here we are gathering to present our overview of key findings on study of youth, identity, and discourse in post-war Sri Lanka. This study the silencing and amplification process that have been used by the creating and enforcing a shared identity discourse focusing on one social group on youth. And our study especially focused on case study of mural wave, which were resurgent trend in 2019 to 2021. And before start the present our finding, I would like to introduce a bit about our social cohesion thematic. Social cohesion thematic continue work with specific focus on post-war period as opposed to post-conflict period in Sri Lanka, and we are work on understanding dialogue between social cohesion, peace, conflict mechanism, and horizontal inequalities. Also, our thematic working on understanding the barriers have been in realized post-war justice and reconciliation in order to prevent cycle of violence and move forward peace in Sri Lanka. And the CEPA, together with the strengthening the reconciliation program of GIZ Sri Lanka and the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation in South Africa, form a consortium to work on barometer survey project in identifying diverse social belief and attitude. And this study is designed to complement the work of the Sri Lanka Barometer, which include evidence generation and outreach activities to inform public debate on reconciliation in Sri Lanka. So our study entitled as Youth, Identity and Discourse in Post-war Sri Lanka. So our study aimed to understand how youth identity is created and enforced, how youth in turn have responded to use, embodied, and transform their process to make their own voice out. And as I already mentioned, our study especially focused on mural wave, which took place between late 2019 and early 2020. And we are managed to transcend beyond discourse surrounding mural in physical and virtual spaces.
So good afternoon. I'm Shanindra, and I will take you through the methodology of our study. So as you can see, we have actually used critical discourse analysis as our method of data analysis. So when we actually planned the study, we wanted to find out the power structures and dynamics inherent within the studied discourse, because as we realized, there was a multiplicity of actors participating in the creation of this discourse and within it. So using critical discourse analysis, we were hoping to actually unearth those power relations and also sort of figure out who has access to the studied discourse, because as per our methodology, we actually identify that there is power in language, behind language, and the use of language. So through the way in which someone uses language, we can sort of identify who actually has the power to shape the discourse and the narratives within it, and then form their own regimes of truth and sort of actually move on to set their agenda in achieving what they want. And as you can also see, we have actually used a multiple ways of collecting the data, but they can actually be categorized into two primary ways of collecting data. The first one being interviews, the other one being social media scoping. In interviews, we actually conducted key person interviews. This included a close approximation of the youth category as we identified within our paper. This actually included the youth between the ages of 18 and 30. In expert interviews, we actually interviewed academics who were studying concepts and phenomena such as youth, post-war Sri Lanka, reconciliation, identity, conflict, and even social media. In in-depth interviews, we actually interviewed the mural artists themselves and their processes of creating the mural. And when we actually planned to conduct this interview in 2021, we realized that the actual mural wave itself and the conversation around it had already moved on to social media or virtual spaces. So as a way of adapting to that change, we also sort of decided to start our study from that by doing a social media scoping of the murals available on social media, and also how the conversation was shaped online. As for the theoretical underpinnings of our study, we actually set out to sort of study the agenda setting function of the state within this discourse and through this discourse, and also the processes of creating identity and performativity of it. But because of the discursive practices of our participants, we also sort of realized that we had to delve more into the study by using other concepts and theories such as gender and imagined communities to get a more cohesive analysis out of the data. Now we will move on to the key findings of our study.
As Sanjay mentioned, let's move to key part of the event. Initially, when we doing the primary literature review and social media scoping, we understood as a political movement of this event. But when we had a discussion with the artists, youth, and people who are engaged with this movement, we realized it was different objective based on the different geographical places, people who are engaged with the movement. And in 2019, in president election, president endorsed the mural wave. So interviewing with the artists, they revealed that the origin of the mural wave was devoid of any political motivation. It was completely aimed on beautifying country, litter unwanted posters and bills. This mural movement actually provide a stage to patriotic youth for freedom of their expression. So once the patriotic youth get the opportunity to be a part of this movement, they decorated the public spaces with Sinhala Buddhist triumphalist image. So, and further strengthening the agenda set by the state, a perpetuation of dominant narrative through the beautification process by youth.
And as you may be able to see on this slide, we were also sort of able to determine that the portrayal and representation of the physical mural wave on social media was not cohesive. This was because it was a one-dimensional narrative of the mural wave, and this narrative included the dominant wave which was being espoused by the government at the time, which is a triumphalist and Sinhala Buddhist sentiment. And we also sort of, through our analysis, identified that this is due to the fact that even at the inception of the 2019 presidential election, the election was happening, the campaign was happening on virtual spaces on social media, especially targeting youth. So the social media, that space had already created a conducive environment to espouse and sustain the kind of narrative which was being portrayed in relation to the mural wave. And in our interviews and in our social media scoping, we were also sort of able to determine that there was a considerable portrayal of gender through the murals, although there were many facets of gender being represented through the murals. We identified the portrayal of the militarized masculine figure as the most prominent iteration of gender performativity on the murals. While the civil and public spaces have already been militarized through the presence of actual military figures, the inclusion of military figures through the medium of murals is also sort of identified as a furthering or as a way of extending this process of militarizing civil and public spaces. What's interesting to us was that this extension of the militarizing of civil spaces was actually done by the public as they were celebrating the militarized masculine figures. So in a way, the public actually in furthering the agenda set by the state in militarizing civil spaces. Another consequence of this was that the public was also establishing and reinforcing the fact that militarized masculinity is the hegemonic masculinity or performativity of masculinity within the larger society. This again points to the fact that the heroic imagery which was used during the civil war in order to recruit youth and create or generate employment amongst them, using the civil war, still has currency to a large extent to this day. And we will also finish our presentation with a recommendation which we were able to reach through the conclusions of our study, which is the importance of education. Although we didn't intend to investigate the role of education within our study, the discursive practices of our interviewees prompted us to actually include that as a part of our study. Because the interviewees kept going back to the education system, the shortcomings of that education system, and how the state actually uses the education system to sustain its monodimensional narrative and sustain its own dominant discourse in post-war Sri Lanka, which is, as we mentioned at the beginning of our presentation, a triumphalist and Sinhala Buddhist sort of sentiment. Although the state may function as a gatekeeper, as a centralized disseminator of education materials, the interviewees actually mentioned that we as individuals may have the opportunity to reform the education system into bringing about a cohesive retelling of histories and teaching of alternative histories and narratives, and sort of prevent the state from suppressing minority narratives and histories, because the most emphasized component of this part of the study was that as long as the state continues to sustain or perpetuate such an education system, it would actually function as an obstacle in achieving reconciliation. This was actually a brief overview of our key findings of our study, and if you actually read our executive summary and the paper, you will be able to find more of an in-depth analysis of what we have presented here. And lastly, I would actually like to thank our partners and supporters in making this study a reality. Thank you.